Something small slammed against Elara's door, then another, then a third. She froze with her hand still on the latch of the wood stove, listening over the groan of old timber and the hiss of sleet against the roof. The sound came again, faint, wet, desperate. Not branches, not wind. She snatched the iron poker from beside the fire, wrapped her shawl tighter, and shoved the door open into a blast of white, so cold it bit the inside of her nose. Snow swirled in hard, needling sheets. The porch lantern had nearly died, its weak gold flame bending sideways in the storm, but it was enough to show 3 small bodies collapsed against her threshold, half buried in drifts. Wolf pups, thin as hunger itself. One tried to lift its head and failed. Another had ice crusted over one ear and both front paws tucked under its chest, as if it had been taught not to cry. The third was sprawled protectively across the other 2, even now, ribs fluttering, a low warning trapped in its frozen throat when Elara crouched down. "Easy," she whispered, though her fingers had already gone numb. Their fur should have been soft with baby down. Instead it was thick, unusually dense, black and silver beneath the snow, marked at the shoulder with crescent-shaped patterns no wild pup in these woods should carry. A strip of torn leather hung around the smallest one's neck, stamped with a symbol the storm kept trying to hide, an upright crown split by a claw mark. Elara stared one heartbeat too long. Then the wind shoved at her back like a hand, and one of the pups gave a tiny, breaking shiver. Choice vanished. She dropped the poker, slid both arms under 2 trembling bodies, then dragged the third against her skirt with the crook of her elbow, boots grinding on frozen boards as she hauled all 3 inside. The cabin door banged shut on the blizzard. Heat from the stove licked at her cheeks, while meltwater soaked through her sleeves and ran cold to her wrists. She laid the pups on a pile of old wool by the fire and moved fast, because stillness in winter meant death. She stripped off their iced leather scraps, rubbed them down with rough linen until the room filled with the smell of wet fur, smoke, and thawing snow. One pup snapped weakly at the cloth, not from strength, but from pride. "Good," she muttered, breath fogging in the cooler corners of the room. "Fight me. That means you're staying." In the cupboard she found the last of yesterday's goat milk, a heel of bread, and broth she had meant to stretch another day. She warmed the milk in a dented tin cup, testing it against her wrist before dipping her fingers and touching it to the smallest muzzle. The pup did not lap like an animal born in the wild. It waited, washed her face, then drank in careful pulls, as if it had once been fed by hand and expected manners even at death's edge. The second nudged the cup toward the weakest one before taking its turn. The largest planted itself between Elara and the others after only 3 mouthfuls, swaying but stubborn, blue-gray eyes fixed on her with a steady, assessing look no common cub should have owned. "You're not strays," she said softly. The fire popped. Outside, the storm clawed at the shutters. One by one, the pups drank, then collapsed closer together on the blanket she had spread. Only when Elara reached to move the largest nearer the heat did she feel it beneath the fur, a narrow ridge against the foreleg, smooth and cold as polished bone. She parted the damp coat and found a slim chain hidden there, worked with silver links too fine for a trapper, too costly for any village child. Hanging from it was the same broken crown crest, this one in moonstone, faintly luminous in the firelight. Her hand stopped. The pup's eyes opened at once. Not glazed, not dazed. A warning lived in them, old and sharp and startlingly human. Then, from somewhere beyond the screaming wind, a wolf's howl rolled across the dark, long, deep, and hunting. All 3 pups jerked awake before the sound had even faded, and for the first time, Elara understood she had not brought home helpless creatures from the storm. She had carried a secret across her own threshold. The fire had burned low, leaving the cabin steeped in red coals and wood smoke, while the storm clawed at the shutters with icy nails. Somewhere in that uneasy dark, 3 small bodies had shifted off the blanket and taken positions without a sound. One near the door, one beneath the window, one beside the bed. By the time Elara pushed herself up on one elbow, chilled air was already spilling across the floorboards and the pups were standing alert, ears lifted toward the forest as if listening to words hidden inside the wind. She fed the fire with 2 more logs and watched the flames lick orange over their fur. In daylight, their differences sharpened. The largest, silver-black and broad through the shoulders, always stepped half a pace in front of the other two. The pale one with a torn ear never ate until the others had taken their share. The smallest, dark as wet pine bark, limped when he thought no one was looking and slept closest to the wall, where no one could come at him from behind. Wild cubs did not do that. Wild cubs snapped, panicked, fought over scraps. These three waited. They measured. They looked at her before they moved, as if deciding whether they could afford trust. Elara tore the last heel of barley bread into a bowl of goat milk thinned with melted snow. Her pantry gave back a hollow answer when she opened it. A handful of oats, dried roots, one strip of smoked hare. Not enough for one woman through the end of the week, never mind 4 hungry mouths. Still, when she set the bowl down, the largest pup nudged it toward the smallest first. The motion was so quick, so practiced, it made her hand still in the cold air. "No," she murmured, voice rough from smoke and sleep. She crouched beside them, split the smoked meat with her knife, then shoved the biggest piece back toward the silver-black one. "You too." For a moment, the pup did not touch it. His eyes lifted to hers, amber in the firelight, old in a way that did not belong to such a small body. Then he lowered his head and ate. That should have been all. A strange night. 3 foundlings. One more burden in a forest that had never offered mercy cheaply. But morning came, and none of them left. They followed her with a silence that pressed close as breath. When she hauled in water from the frozen barrel outside, they ringed the doorway and watched the tree line. When she chopped kindling, the pale pup sorted the sticks she dropped into neat little piles with his paws, pushing the driest pieces nearest the hearth. When the smallest tried to climb onto the stool to reach the windowsill and slipped, the silver-black one braced him with his body before Elara could cross the room. By noon, the cabin no longer felt like a place where animals had taken shelter. It felt like a room holding its breath around children too disciplined to cry. The thought came unwelcome and would not leave. She found one of the moonstone crests beneath the blanket while shaking out the snow-damp wool. Broken crown, smooth edge, fine chain snapped clean through. Not a hunter's token, not a traitor's charm. Something made to be worn and hidden. Elara wrapped it back in the blanket before any of them could see her holding it. That was the first thing she chose. The second came an hour later, with the sun a pale smear behind cloud and the cold needling under the door. She pulled on her cloak, took the empty rabbit snare from its peg, and reached for the latch. 3 pups moved into her path at once. Not whining, not begging, blocking. The smallest planted himself directly over the hem of her skirt. The pale one stared at the latch. The silver-black one held her gaze and bared just the edge of one white tooth, not at her, but at the world beyond the wood. "If I don't go, none of us eat tonight," Elara said softly. Their ears flicked. No one moved. The room carried the sharp smell of ash and old pine resin. Outside, the storm had thinned to a brittle silence. She looked from one to the next, then crouched and touched the broad forehead of the silver-black pup with 2 fingers. "Listen to me. I'm coming back." The words sounded foolish the moment they left her mouth, because she had never promised such a thing to anyone. Yet the change in them was immediate. The pale one stepped aside first. The smallest limped back toward the fire. The silver-black pup remained where he was for one long beat, studying her face as if weighing a vow, then lowered his head and let her pass. Snow cracked under her boots as she checked her traps through the pines. The forest smelled clean and cruel, all frost and bark and the faint iron scent of distant stone. She found only one rabbit, half frozen and light in the hand. But when the cabin came back into view through the trees, smoke rising thin from the chimney, something inside her chest tightened hard enough to hurt. One dark shape sat in the window, waiting. Another paced behind the door. They had not run. That should have made things easier. Instead, it made everything worse, because by the time she skinned the rabbit and set broth to simmer, she was no longer deciding whether to shelter strange creatures for one night. She was measuring flour with a careful hand, counting days, and moving her own blanket to the floor so the 3 of them could keep the bed near the fire. The smallest curled against her wrist after eating, all trembling warmth and soft fur, and did not wake when she shifted. The pale one settled at her back. Near the door, the silver-black pup kept watch with his chin on his paws and his eyes half open, as though the task belonged to him and always had. Elara lay awake listening to the broth bubble low in the iron pot and the wind drag over the roof. Her knife rested beneath the pillow now. Her food would not last. Whoever had driven these creatures into a blizzard had not done it by accident. None of that changed the shape of the little body asleep against her hand. Before the fire sank to embers, she turned her face toward the dark and made the decision without speaking it aloud. Whatever had crossed her threshold that night, she would hide it as long as she could. By dawn, the snow had hardened into a crust that cracked under any weight, and the forest carried sound too well. Wind hissed through the pine needles. Somewhere far off, a raven gave one sharp cry, then nothing. Inside the cabin, the broth had gone thin enough to see the bottom of the pot, and the fire smelled of damp cedar and old smoke. Elara was kneeling beside the hearth, breaking the last heel of black bread into the stew, when the smallest pup lifted its head before any human ear could have caught it. Then the others were up too, silent, rigid, listening toward the trees. That stillness traveled straight into her hands. She set the spoon down without a sound and crossed to the frost-filmed window. At first she saw only white trunks and drifting light, pale as bone between the branches. Then she saw the marks. Not animal tracks wandering at random, but a ring of prints laid down and doubled back, careful, deliberate, close enough to the cabin wall that whoever made them had tested the shadow beneath her window. Her breath clouded the glass. One of the pups came to stand against her calf, not whining now, not begging, only waiting. Outside, a strip of red cloth had been tied to a low branch sometime in the night. It moved in the wind like a wound that would not close. Elara stepped back from the window and reached for her boots, her knife, the old fur-lined cloak hanging by the door. Under the bed, she whispered. The command left her mouth before she thought about it, and all three obeyed. Fast. Too fast for wild things. Their small bodies vanished into shadow beneath the rough wooden frame while she kicked snow from the latch and opened the door just enough to slip through. Cold hit like a slap, dry and bright, burning the inside of her nose. The tracks were fresh. Boot prints this time, half covered but not gone, broad in the heel, made by more than one person. They had circled the cabin, paused at the woodpile, the back wall, the narrow lean-to where she kept kindling, then vanished toward the lower trail that led east. Not hunters passing through. Searchers narrowing in. Elara moved quickly, scrubbing the visible paw prints near the doorstep with a pine bough, then scattering ash from the bucket over the packed snow. Her fingers went numb almost at once. She found another sign near the split stump beside the chopping block, 3 shallow cuts carved into the wood, straight and evenly spaced. A mark left to be seen. A warning or a signal. The wind shifted, carrying a scent that did not belong to her forest. Wet leather, horse sweat, iron. She froze. Through the trees, downhill, and moving carefully between the trunks, 2 figures in winter cloaks appeared where no one should have been this deep after a storm. They were too far away for faces, but not for purpose. One pointed toward the cabin. Elara turned and ran. The snow dragged at her shins as she drove back to the door, shouldered inside, and slammed the bar into place. The cabin felt smaller now, every crack in the wall suddenly a weakness. Under the bed, 6 bright eyes watched her. She dropped to her knees. Listen to me. Her voice came low and hard. Not a sound. The largest pup crawled out first instead of hiding deeper. He seized the hem of her skirt gently but firmly and tugged toward the rear corner of the room, where sacks of turnips and dried roots had been stacked against the wall since fall. Elara stared, then shoved them aside. Behind them, half hidden by age-blackened boards, was the outline of a trapdoor she had never noticed beneath a warped rug. For one stunned second, she could only look at it. Then the pup pressed his nose to the seam and looked back at her with a fierce, impatient stillness that felt almost like reprimand. Outside, snow crunched close to the cabin. A man's voice carried through the trees, muffled by distance but drawing nearer. Elara dragged the rug clear, hooked frozen fingers into the iron ring, and pulled. The door lifted with a groan, breathing up a smell of earth, dust, and old pine resin. A root cellar. Narrow, dark, just big enough. She gathered the smallest pup first, then the other 2, lowering them into the cold below. None fought her. None made a sound. When she climbed back up, the first knock hit the front door, slow, heavy, certain. It shook ash from the rafters. Elara lowered the trapdoor, threw the rug back over it, and rose with the knife in her hand as a second knock landed harder than the first. Someone had found the cabin. Now they were asking to be let in. The latch gave a small iron cry as the door opened an inch, letting in a blade of white cold and the smell of wet fur, leather, and snowmelt. 3 figures stood on the porch beneath hooded cloaks dusted in ice, their boots dark with slush, their faces hidden except for pale mouths and watchful eyes. Elara kept the knife low against her thigh and used her body to block the room behind her. "Storm's bad enough without strangers wandering in it," she said. The tallest of them inclined his head, too polite for a hunter, too still for a man asking shelter. "We seek lost animals," he said, and his voice carried the clipped control of someone used to being obeyed. 3 young ones. Dangerous to keep, if found. Wind hissed through the pines. Somewhere beneath the floor, silence held. Elara let her gaze move over their gloves, their belts, the thin silver whistles hanging at their throats. "Not trappers. Not villagers. No animals here," she answered. "Only me and a weak fire." For a moment, no one moved. Then the shortest of the strangers lifted his head sharply, nostrils flaring toward the cabin's warmth, and the boards under Elara's bare feet seemed to turn to glass. She smiled without softness and widened the door just enough for them to see the empty table, the hanging herbs, the kettle steaming over low coals. "Look if you like," she said, gambling on nerve instead of force. "But wipe your boots." It was not permission they expected. That bought her one startled breath. In that breath, a muffled thump came from under the floorboards. Not loud, just enough. The shortest man's eyes snapped downward. Elara moved first. She let the kettle tip with the back of her wrist. Boiling water crashed across the threshold in a cloud of steam, making all 3 men curse and recoil. Before they could recover, she slammed the door and dropped the bar into place. The cabin shook under the first impact from outside. The second rattled the cups on the shelf. "Quiet," she whispered, already ripping the rug aside and hauling up the trapdoor. Earth-cold air rushed into her face. 3 pairs of eyes glimmered below in the dark. "Out. Now." They came up fast, not like panicked cubs, but with eerie precision. One first, then the other 2, each waiting half a heartbeat for the next as if obeying an old drilled order. Another blow hit the door. Splinters jumped from the frame. Elara did not run for the back window. Instead, she snatched the moonstone crest she had hidden near the hearth, the one that had slipped from the smallest pup's neck the night she found them. In daylight, it caught the fire in its white center and threw back the image etched into silver. A crown broken clean through the middle, ringed by 3 crescent marks. The largest pup saw it and froze. Not with fear, with offense. A low sound gathered in his chest, restrained, furious, almost a protest. Then he stepped between Elara and the pounding door. The other 2 flanked him at once. Snowlight from the shutter cracks silvered their fur, and for one breathless instant, they did not look small. They looked arranged, claimed by something older than instinct. Outside, a voice rose through the wood. "By order of the crown, open." Elara stared at the crest in her hand, then at the 3 young wolves standing in a line before her hearth. Crown. The word struck against every strange thing she had seen. Their discipline, the hidden moonstone, the way they had never fought over food, never slept without one keeping watch. The smallest pup glanced at the crest, then bowed his head once to the largest, not as a sibling yielding a scrap, but as a subject yielding rank. Understanding did not arrive all at once. It assembled itself from details she could no longer ignore. These were not lost beasts. These were children raised inside power, so absolute it had taught itself into their bones before they had even grown into their fangs. The broken crown was not a hunter's mark. It was lineage, and whatever had broken it had sent royal blood into the snow to die. The bar groaned, would crack near the hinge. Elara's grip tightened around the crest until its edge bit her palm. "If they're here by order of the crown," she said softly, looking at the 3 of them, "then the crown wants them dead." The largest pup turned his head toward her. His eyes, gold in the dim firelight, held steady on hers. Then, with solemn care that made the room go still, he lowered himself to one knee the way no wild creature ever could, and the other 2 followed. Not begging, not hiding, presenting themselves. Trusting her with the truth, they could not speak. Another hit split the frame. Cold air knifed through the crack. Elara slid the crest into her pocket, lifted the axe from beside the woodpile, and faced the door as the cabin shuddered around them. Now she knew what they were. The worst question was already at her throat. If royal blood was kneeling at her feet, who exactly was outside trying to claim it? Wind pushed through the split door in thin, screaming threads, carrying pine pitch, wet fur, and the iron bite of snow. Beyond the threshold, the dark trees stood shoulder to shoulder under a washed-out moon, and somewhere far off, a wolf answered with a howl so deep the floorboards seemed to remember it. Elara tightened both hands on the axe handle until the rough wood pressed crescents into her palms. The three pups had moved without a sound. One at the stove, one beside the table, the smallest near the root cellar hatch, chin lifted, silver eyes fixed on the ruined doorway, as if waiting for judgment. Then the forest gave another sound, not the careless crack of a hunter's step, but the fast, disciplined rhythm of many bodies crossing ice. The strangers at her door had not come alone. They had only been the edge of something larger. Far to the north, where the black ridges of the mountain cut the sky, a larger pack ran under moonlight. Snow burst beneath massive paws. Men in travel cloaks kept pace where they could, falling behind where they could not. At their center moved something colder than the storm and harder than the stone beneath it. Lucian did not waste breath on orders unless he meant blood or mercy, and tonight he had very little mercy left to spend. Frost clung to the ends of his dark hair. A shallow cut crossed one knuckle, reopened each time his fist tightened. Again, he said, and the word dropped into the night like a blade. A scout stumbled forward, chest heaving steam. The trail vanished near the lower birch line, my king. Lucian stopped so abruptly the rest nearly crashed into him. The scent in the air was old snow, bark, rabbit, fox, and beneath it all, so faint most wolves would have missed it, the vanished warmth of milk breath and moonstone. His three sons, buried under days of wind, smeared with smoke, hidden by someone who knew enough to make searching difficult, not enough to make him stop. He crouched and pressed his fingers into a drift where the surface had iced over. A tiny claw mark had frozen inside it. Very young, forced to run before they should have. Something shifted in his face then, not softer, only more dangerous. They're alive. Relief flashed through the men around him too quickly, then disappeared when he rose. If they were found first, Lucian said, voice low, then whoever found them is either dead already or brave. No one answered. They all knew the other possibility, the one no one dared shape into words. If an enemy held the princes, dawn would bring demands. If a traitor within the royal pack had arranged their disappearance, then every mile north was packed with lies wearing familiar faces. He turned to his captain, Garin, a scarred wolf with sleet frozen white on his beard. Seal the ridge roads. Quietly. No banners, no horns. I want no whisper of my sons moving ahead of me. Garin bowed once. And the houses that delayed their riders? Lucian looked back toward the storm-dark east, where the royal stronghold waited behind walls and politics and polished deceit. When I return, he said, they can explain themselves. The sentence was calm. That frightened his men more than rage would have. They ran on, through cedar shadows and knee-deep drifts, across a creek skinned with glass ice. Once, Lucian slowed near an abandoned waymarker and touched the splintered post. The wood held another trace, human this time. Female. Smoke, wool, dried rosemary, and the faint clean scent of someone who chopped her own firewood and slept alone. Not pack, not court. A strange flicker crossed his expression, gone before it could become trust. Someone sheltered them, he said. Garin came beside him, or stole them and covered the trail well. Lucian's eyes flashed gold in the moonlight. Then I'll know which one I stand in front of them. Back in the cabin, resin popped in the stove and sent a shower of orange light across the walls. Elara heard the first heavy impact outside, not at the door this time, but at the rear shutter. The whole frame rattled. She spun. Another hit. Then silence. Not retreat. Placement. Whoever was out there was circling, testing the boards, the windows, the roofline. The pups understood it too. The largest gave a sharp, commanding sound deep in his throat. Not fear. Instruction. The other two moved at once, one dragging an old feed sack toward the hearth, the smallest pawing at spilled ash, smearing their own scent beneath smoke. Elara stared for half a breath, then followed their lead. "All right," she whispered, already moving. She kicked snow over the blood on the threshold where a splinter had cut her hand, shoved wet hides against the crack in the door, and doused the lantern nearest the window. The room dropped into dim orange and blue. Outside, footsteps approached from two sides. Human, deliberate. But farther back, softer and quicker through the trees, came a tread that was not human at all. The storm had changed. This was no longer a search. It was a closing net. In the mountains, Lucian reached the birch line just as dawn began bleeding gray through the clouds. A broken snare wire hung from one branch, glittering with ice. Below it, half buried in snow, lay the body of one of his outer sentries. No gore, no torn flesh, only a twisted neck and a royal token missing from his belt. Garen swore under his breath. Lucian knelt, touched the dead man's coat, and smelled what death had left behind. Stranger wolves masking their scent with pitch and grave dirt, and beneath that, the same human trail turning south toward the old forest cabins. Someone had taken the princes. Someone else had chased them there. He rose, every muscle going still in that terrible way a predator stills before the strike. "No more wide search," he said. "We hunt the cabin." Garen looked toward the pale horizon. "If this is a trap, it is," Lucian said. "For one of us." He shifted before the last word had fully left him, bones rolling under skin, cloak dropping into the snow. A massive black wolf stood where the king had been, breath smoking in the bitter dawn, eyes burning like banked coals. Then he launched downhill toward the southern forest so fast the snow behind him exploded. Miles away, in the dim cabin, the smallest pup suddenly lifted his head toward the wind and froze. Not at the men outside. At something farther away, older, stronger, and coming fast enough to change everything. Frost had crept clear across the inside of the window by morning, turning the cabin glass white and brittle as bone. Beneath the floorboards, three small bodies shifted in the dark, and the faint scrape of claws against old pine came in a rhythm too measured to belong to ordinary cubs. Elara dropped to her knees and lifted the trapdoor a careful inch. Cold air breathed up from the crawlspace, carrying the musk of damp fur, ash, and the last strips of dried venison she had hidden for them. "Quiet," she whispered. But the smallest one was already staring past her shoulder, silver eyes fixed on the door as if it had heard a command she hadn't. It was not the panic of hunted animals anymore. It was waiting. The cabin still wore the marks of the night before. A broken stool near the hearth, soot smeared across the stones, one shutter hanging crooked where the wind clicked it softly against the wall. Elara slid down into the cramped dark with a lantern turned low, the flame trembling gold over packed earth. The three pups back together without being told. That was what made her chest tighten. Not fear. Training. The oldest lowered his head toward her hand, then touched his nose to the moonstone crest hanging from the cord at her wrist, the one she had taken from beneath their bedding when the attackers came. In the dim light, the carving showed again. A crown split through the center, and beneath it, three tiny marks like rising moons. The middle pup gave a soft sound in his throat and pressed one paw to his own chest, then to the crest, then to each of his brothers in turn. Elara watched, breath held, and understood with a sharp, quiet certainty that settled colder than the air around them. Not a pack mark, not a hunter's charm, a family seal, a bloodline. "You're not just hidden," she murmured. "You were taken." The oldest pup did not blink. Instead, he stepped forward and bowed his head once, solemn as a child standing before an altar. Something moved outside, not the hard tread of men forcing a search. A single set of boots stopping at her porch. Elara's head snapped up. Then came a voice through the wood, rough with winter and age. "Girl, open." It was Mara from the lower trail, a widow who traded roots and lamp oil twice a month and trusted no one enough to waste words on them. Elara shoved the trapdoor shut, stood, and slid the bolt back just enough to face her through the crack. Snow crusted the hem of Mara's cloak. One side of her face was red from the wind. In her gloved fist, she held a strip of black leather stamped with the same broken crown. "Found this hanging on a branch half a mile east," Mara said. "And I found tracks around it. Wolf. Boot. More than a few." Her eyes narrowed, sharp as hooks. They're offering silver in the village. Food too. For anyone who gives up what's being hidden in these woods. Elara said nothing. Mara looked past her into the dim cabin, to the hearth, to the extra bowls stacked by the wash basin, then back again. You've always been too soft where hungry things are concerned. She opened her hand. The leather strap swung once in the pale light. Listen carefully. By sundown this place won't belong to you anymore. Not if they decide you're sheltering what they lost. The wind pressed hard against the door, bringing the resin smell of pine and the distant cry of crows. Under the floor, not a sound. Mara leaned closer. Come down with me now. Say you found cubs and handed them off. They'll take your cabin instead of your throat. It was not kindness in her voice, only blunt warning. Elara looked at the leather strap, then at the flour sack in the corner, nearly empty, at the split skin over her knuckles from the night before, at the door she had barred with furniture because 3 small creatures had chosen to trust her. Behind the wall, the fire popped softly, and she could hear one tiny claw tap once under the floorboards, waiting on her answer. Mara extended her hand. Choose. Elara reached for the strap, and for a heartbeat Mara seemed to think she had won. But Elara only took the black leather, folded Mara's fingers back over the silver coins in her palm that should have bought next week's oats, and pushed the hand away. If they come, she said, voice low and steady. You never stopped here. Mara stared at her, as if measuring whether this was courage or madness. Then she closed her fist over the coins, spat into the snow, and stepped back from the threshold. Then pray whatever they are can save you, she said. Because no one else will. Elara shut the door, dropped the bolt, and stood still until Mara's boots faded down the trail. Then she crossed the cabin, tore the last wool blanket in half, and began wrapping what little food remained. Her hands moved quickly now, with no room left for doubt. One by one she opened the trapdoor and looked into 3 lifted faces shining in the lantern glow. We're leaving before dark, she said. The oldest pup straightened at once. The smallest pressed against her wrist. Outside, far off but coming closer, a wolf answered the wind with a call so deep the iron kettle on the hook gave a faint, trembling ring. The howl came again, close enough this time to shake loose a drift of snow from the roof. Cold blue light pressed through the cracks in the shutters, and the iron kettle swayed on its hook with a thin, nervous tap. Elara froze beside the open trapdoor, one hand still wrapped around the lantern handle, while below her the 3 pups had gone utterly still, not cowering, listening. The oldest lifted his head first, ears sharpened toward the door, and the other 2 followed with the same uncanny discipline that had never belonged to ordinary wild things. Then a second sound reached the cabin, boots breaking crusted snow, slow, heavy, unhurried, as if whoever approached had no fear of what waited inside. Elara dropped the trapdoor shut, slid the rug over it with her foot, and snatched the hatchet from the chopping block by the hearth. Smoke, wool, and old pine resin thickened the air. A single knock landed against the door. Once. Enough to make the frame groan. Open it, said a man's voice from the other side, low as winter thunder. You have something that belongs to me. Elara did not move toward him. Then you can stand in the cold and say what it is. For a beat, only the wind answered, carrying the sharp scent of ice and animal musk through the warped boards. Then the latch lifted. She had barred it, but the wood split anyway with a hard crack, and the door shoved inward beneath the weight of a broad shoulder wrapped in black fur and snow. He filled the threshold like night made solid, tall, bareheaded despite the storm, dark hair rimmed white with frost, a scar cutting one brow, his coat heavy with the smell of cedar, blood, and mountain wind. Power came off him in waves so strong the flame inside her lantern bent sideways. Elara raised the hatchet before he took a second step. Another inch, she said, and you leave with fewer fingers than you came with. His gold eyes dropped to the blade, then lifted to her face. Not amused, not offended, measuring. Behind him, 2 more figures waited among the pines, wolves at their heels, but neither crossed the clearing. This one had not brought them forward because he had not needed to. Beneath the floorboards, a faint scratch. The smallest pup. The man heard it. His gaze shifted once to the rug, and the room changed. Not louder. Worse. Like a bowstring pulled to its last thread. Stand aside, he said. Now. Elara tightened her grip until the hatchet handle bit her palm. Tell me their names first. Something flashed across his face then, quick and raw enough to break the iron control around it. "If they are here," he said, and his voice dropped lower still, "their names are none of your shield." He moved, not toward her throat or the blade, but toward the hearth, circling just enough to see more of the floor. Elara stepped with him and blocked the way again. The lantern threw both their shadows huge against the wall, his cutting over hers refusing to yield. "You don't walk into my home, break my door, and drag children out like stolen meat." At that, his head turned sharply back to her. "Children, not cubs, not animals." The word hung in the smoke between them. Under the rug, the boards thudded once. Then, before Elara could stop it, the oldest pup shoved the trapdoor upward from below. The edge jumped, the rug slid, and a gray muzzle appeared in the gap, followed by two others pressing close behind. For one suspended second, no one breathed. The great man on the threshold stared as if the world had narrowed to three small bodies and the white crescent marks above their eyes. His hand, scarred and bare in the cold, opened at his side and trembled once. The oldest pup climbed up first, then shifted mid-motion in a rush of silver light and heat, shrinking fur into skin until a dark-haired boy of perhaps 8 knelt on the floorboards, breathing hard, broken crown crest hanging against his thin chest. The other two followed, one after another, lights spilling over the cabin walls, until 3 boys stood where the pups had been, small, pale from hunger, shoulders squared with the same impossible training Elara had seen in them from the beginning. The smallest reached for her skirt. The middle one stepped half in front of his brothers. The oldest looked straight at the stranger and whispered, hoarse with disbelief, "Father." The word hit the room harder than the broken door had. Elara's fingers loosened on the hatchet by a fraction, but she did not lower it. The man before her had gone absolutely still. Then he crossed the space in 2 strides and dropped to one knee on the rough plank floor, black fur spilling into ashes from the hearth, snow melting off his boots into dark circles. He touched the oldest boy's cheek as if he expected him to vanish. "Cashin." His hand moved to the middle child's shoulder. "Orin." Then to the littlest, who was already climbing against him with a sob he had clearly held too long. "Tavin." Only after that did he lift his face to Elara. Up close, the command in him was even more brutal for being leashed, but gratitude was there too, buried deep and fighting its way to the surface like fire under ice. "I am Lucian," he said, "king of the North Pack." Elara swallowed the taste of smoke and fear and stood her ground between him and the rest of the room, even now. "Then start acting like a father," she said, "not a king who thinks he can take what he wants." One of the men outside shifted at that, but Lucian raised a hand without looking back, silencing the clearing. His sons clung to his coat, yet his eyes stayed on the woman with the hatchet. He had found what he came for, but he had found it in a cabin guarded by someone who had chosen his children over silver, food, and safety. "We leave tonight," he said at last, rising slowly. The boys gathered tight against him. "All of us. Because the ones hunting them were never behind me. They were following my trail." Wind pressed against the cabin walls in long, frozen groans, and the fire snapped low in the hearth, throwing copper light across wet boots, rough floorboards, and the royal leather strap lying near the door like a thing that had finally found its owner. Snowmelt darkened the hem of Lucian's coat. Outside, horses shifted, tack creaking softly, but no one dared speak. Then the youngest boy flinched at a sound under the floor, and Elara felt it too, a dull thud beneath the planks, followed by the faint scrape of wood on wood. Lucian's head turned at once, not toward the door, down. His hand shot out, pushing Orin and his brothers behind him just as Elara dropped to one knee and pressed her palm to the boards. Another impact answered her, harder this time. "Not wolves. Men. There's space under the root cellar," she said, already reaching for the iron ring set into the trapdoor near the stove. "They used it before." Lucian's eyes narrowed, quick and cold, but he moved when she moved. Together they dragged the table aside, mugs rattling, broth sloshing over the rim of a cracked bowl. The smell of ash and old pine rose as Elara yanked the door open. A rush of earth-cold air hit her face. Beneath the cabin, packed snow and black dirt framed a narrow crawl space, and a gloved hand was forcing up a second hatch from below. Lucian drew a blade in one smooth motion, But Elara caught his wrist before steel could flash. "Alive," she hissed. The word came out white in the cold. He looked at her once, measuring, then struck the intruder's hand with the flat of the blade instead of the edge. A cry burst from below. Garen was through the front door an instant later, dragging a struggling man up from the cellar's shaft by the collar. The intruder's hood fell back. Human. Frost crusted his beard, and stitched inside his coat, visible where the seam had torn, was the gray wolf insignia of the North Pack Guard. Silence hit harder than the wind. Lucian took one step forward. "Say the name." The man's split lip trembled. His eyes moved to the boys, then to the king, and something like relief broke under the fear, as if being caught by Lucian was safer than returning empty-handed. "Lord Valen," he whispered. He said the princes had to stay lost until the thaw. Said the kingdom needed one strong heir, not 3 young mouths and a grieving king. Orin made a small sound behind his father, and Elara saw Lucian's shoulders lock as if iron had been driven straight through him. The room changed around that silence. The hunters in the trees were no longer faceless men following tracks through snow for silver. They belonged to the crown. To his crown. Garen shoved the captive against the wall hard enough to shake soot from the rafters. "Valen rode with us for 2 days," he said, voice low and dangerous. "He wept when the trail vanished." "He laid the false trail," Lucian answered. No shout, no snarl. That was worse. His gaze dropped to the broken crown stones hanging at each boy's throat, then lifted to Elara. In the firelight, with Frost still silvering his dark hair and his sons crowded against his sides, he looked less like a man reunited with his children than a king standing in the ruins of what he thought he ruled. Elara felt the truth settle cold and heavy. By hiding the boys, by feeding them, by keeping them alive long enough for Lucian to reach this cabin, she had stepped into the center of a struggle that could crush villages, packs, and anyone too near the bloodline. Mara had seen searchers near the lower trail. More would come, not for stray cubs now, but for princes, and for the woman who had kept them from dying. Lucian turned to Garen. "Burn every marker on the king's road. No banners, no escort lines. Valen thinks he's drawing children into a snare." He reached for the captive's collar and hauled the man close enough that frost shook from the man's hood onto the floor. "He can wait for me instead." Then his attention shifted to Elara, and this time there was no command in it, only the weight of what her choice had become. "If you leave now, you may still vanish before dawn," he said. "If you come with us, Valen will know your face before the next snowfall ends." Behind him, the boys did not let go of his coat. Beside the open cellar, cold air kept rising from the dark below like the breath of the trap that had nearly closed under all of them. Outside, somewhere beyond the trees, a horn sounded once, low, distant, and answered by another farther off. They were tightening the ring. A third horn rolled through the trees, closer now, and the cabin answered with its own sounds. Kettle lid rattling on dying coals, cellar rope creaking, the quick, uneven breath of children trying to stay quiet. Frost feathered the edges of the one small window, turning the moonlight into a pale blur. Lucian did not look toward the door when the call faded. He looked at the woman standing between his sons and the dark of the room, as if she were the last thing in this forest he had not already learned to fear losing. Elara moved first. She crossed to the table, seized the royal-marked leather strap the intruder had dropped below, and held it over the flame until the stamped crown blackened and smoked. The smell of scorched hide filled the cabin. "If Valen's men want a sign," she said, tying the hot strap around a bundle of old furs, "we give them one." Lucian's gaze sharpened. Outside, snow hissed against the walls. Inside, Orin straightened before either man or king could answer. "The ravine path," the middle prince said, voice thin but steady. "Tavin and Cashin know how to cross without leaving much scent." Lucian turned to him with something raw in his face, but the boy had already grabbed his brother's hands. Elara shoved open the back hatch. Knife-cold air rushed in, carrying pine resin, snow, and the faint iron smell of armed wolves. "Take them down to the creek bed," she told Lucian. "The water will break the trail. I'll send your hunters to the east slope." "No," he said at once. It was a king's voice again, low and dangerous, built to end arguments. Elara did not lower her chin. "You asked me to choose." She thrust the smoking decoy bundle into his hands, then reached for the antler horn hanging above her hearth. I just did. For one beat. The room held still except for the fire. Then Lucian gave a single sharp nod and moved. It was terrifying how fast he changed the space around him. One moment a broad-shouldered man in a cramped cabin. The next, command itself. He swept Taven up, caught Cashin by the wrist, and with Orin at his side vanished through the hatch into the white dark beyond. Elara waited until the night swallowed the sound of their steps. Then she lifted the horn and blew. The note split the forest open. Shouts answered almost at once from the eastern treeline. Lantern light began to move between the trunks, orange and hungry. She ran straight toward it. Snow broke under her boots in hard, crisp snaps. Branches clawed at her sleeves. When the first shapes emerged through the storm haze, wolves in half-shift, men with spears and fur cloaks marked in Northpack silver, she hurled the burning leather bundle into a drift below the ridge. There, one of them shouted. 3 bodies lunged downhill after the falling smoke. The rest followed, and that was when the forest itself seemed to rise. A roar tore across the slope, not from one throat, but a dozen. Lucian's loyal guard burst from the pines on the western flank, gray cloaks ghosting through snow, and Valen's ring collapsed into chaos. Elara staggered back against a cedar trunk as wolves crashed past in streaks of white and black, snarls drowned beneath the wind. Lucian came up from the creek bed at the center of it all, sword in one hand, the boys behind him with 2 guards shielding them. He did not charge blindly. He pointed once through the swirling snow, and every loyal wolf moved where he sent them. A tall figure tried to break for the ravine, silver clasp bright at his throat. Valen. Lucian cut him off before he reached the trees. No wild strike, no wasted motion, just steel flashing pale in the moonlight and the crack of authority that stopped the whole ridge. Kneel. Valen froze. Around him, his men were already dropping weapons into the snow. The usurper's eyes slid to Elara, and contempt curled his mouth. You would stain the line for a forest stray? Lucian's answer came without heat, which made it colder. She kept my sons alive when my own house failed them. He stepped forward, close enough that Valen finally bowed his head. Then Lucian turned, not to his soldiers, but to the woman whose hands were red with cold and ash. Snow clung to her lashes. Her cabin fire smoke still lived in her clothes. The 3 boys broke from the guards and ran to her first, colliding against her knees and waist in a tangle of fur-lined sleeves and shaking breath. Lucian watched them bury themselves in her, as if they had already chosen the shape of home. When he reached her, he removed the heavy winter clasp from his own cloak, a piece of blackened silver worked with the crescent of the North Pack, and fastened it at her throat with hands that were careful now. Let every pack hear it, he said, his voice carrying over kneeling men, over wind, over the last brittle groan of the storm. No hand will touch Elara without answering to their king. No tongue will name her low while my sons call her protector. She is under my crown, under my house, and under my word. No one spoke. Even the snow seemed to fall more softly. In the distance, dawn began as a thin line of silver behind the firs. The boys pressed close to her sides. Lucian stood before them all, and the forest that had nearly devoured them gave back one clear, quiet truth. The king had found his sons at last, but it was the woman who saved them who taught him where his family truly was.